Hello, welcome to Nancy's Notions Wardrobe Builder. I'm Joy Mahone, and in 2021, I'm going to take you through making a new garment each and every month in this Wardrobe Builder series, along with all the tips and tricks that you're going to need to have amazing results. Now, don't forget to subscribe and click the notification so you don't miss a single video in the Wardrobe Builder series. Now, for those of you who are confident sewers, we're going to build on your skills and just challenge you to increase your sewing abilities. If you're new to sewing, don't worry because we're going to give you all the tips and tricks that you are going to need to have amazing results. So in this lesson, we are going to jump into a wardrobe favorite, the fashion hoodie. So from casual to classy, we're going to see what we can come up with and have an amazing garment at the end of this month. Everyone loves a fashion hoodie, and they can look classy or casual simply based on the fabric that you choose. So let's take a look. We can use sweatshirt fleece, we have faux fur, we have our wonderful wardrobe builder knit, which we will be sewing in this lesson. So just be creative, pick a color that suits your personality. There are some instructions on the back of your pattern envelope, which will list some additional fabric suggestions. In our lesson, we're going to be covering McCall's 8143 as our pattern, and we will be sewing view C, which includes a great hood. Now you'll see in one of our samples that we have created a design using some faux fur. And I just want to point out that a faux fur is a fabric that has something called a nap. And what that means is if you pet or brush or run the fabric one direction, it's going to look a certain way. And then if you brush or do it another direction, how the fabric lays is going to be slightly different. If you're using a fabric such as that or something that has a stripe or a pattern, do make sure that you order some additional fabric so that you have enough. It's going to be really important that you cut your pieces out all going the same direction. Otherwise, you might have some crazy things going on. And sometimes that's a design element too, so just run with it. But here again are some samples that'll give you some inspiration. What we're gonna do next is take a look at the actual pattern pieces and get our design cut out. All right, so the first thing we need to do in order to create our garment is to actually cut our pattern pieces out of the fabric. I've already gone ahead and cut mine out. You'll be able to open your pattern and read the pattern instructions that are in there, and it will tell you all the pieces. They have a number on them, and you can certainly cut out everything that you need. They are made out of a lightweight tissue, which can be a little wrinkly. You can easily iron that with your iron or just kind of smooth it. So some sewers don't realize that you can iron these guys, which makes it a little bit easier for cutting out your pieces. Now read your pattern pieces. They're going to say things like cut 4 out of your fabric, or they might say cut 2 out of a lining or interfacing. So everything we need to sew is going to be printed on our pattern pieces. So for new sewers, that's a great tool for you. Let's talk about sizing on this particular pattern because fit and sizing is a really important part of sewing a garment. I love the fashion hoodie because it's a garment that confident sewers can kind of modify, and based on the fabrics they choose, they can make things fit a little bit differently. But if you're a new sewer, you will have a carefree time creating this pattern because it's really a garment that is fairly unisex in fit. So focus on the skills and techniques on this pattern, and then later on as you hone your skills, you can delve into more fitting. And as far as sizing, there's going to be you won't be able to see it here, but there is a measurement chart on the back, so just take those measurements and you'll be able to pick out the size that you will be using. Your pattern guide will also give you a little list on the back of the envelope, such as the zipper and a few notions you might need. I have things here like a rotary cutter, which is not just for quilting. This is a great tool once you have your pattern pieces laid out, depending on the fabric, that you can easily cut around. So don't discount using that as a tool. We have fabric chalk, we have a tracing wheel chalk marker, a marking pencil, and of course a tool called a hem gauge, which is adjustable, and it's a great tool for being able to measure different areas, along with pins and your scissors. So that's really all we need to get started. What I'd like to do now is to look at the actual actual pattern pieces and talk a little more about knit fabrics, and then we'll be well on our way. As we are laying out our pattern pieces on our fabric, we want to pay attention to a few characteristics of the fabric along with some of the markings that are on our patterns. The primary marking that we look for on our pattern pieces is what's called the grain line. And on most garments, it's going to run vertically up and down, and that helps the garments to lay correctly on the body and hang and drape correctly as well. When you're laying your fabric or your patterns out on your fabric, that grain line should run parallel to the salvage edge, that is that raw edge on your fabric. It should also run parallel to the fold. I have the fold closest to me and the salvage farthest away. And so you can easily measure one side of the grain to the edge, and then you can go down to the other edge of the grain line and measure, and that distance should be the same. Now, what's interesting is when you're working with knit fabrics, you want to make sure that the most stretch goes around the circumference of your body. Now, on knit fabrics, they are kind of classified as a one-way or a two-way stretch. Feel free to check out our Nancy's Notions Wardrobe Builder 101 videos for more information and a longer lesson on grain with knits. But we want to make sure that we have the most stretch going around our body, and the most stretch is going to run perpendicular to the vertical or the long edges, which is the salvage and the grain. Okay, we're gonna look at some markings on our patterns, and we'll be able to pin these down and get them cut out. There are different things on your patterns called notches, and they look like little triangular pieces. You'll see a little single triangular notch that typically references the front of a garment or when you're bringing two pieces together. In this case right here, there's a single notch on the sleeve, a corresponding one on the other side. So if we folded the sleeve in half, which we will do when we're sewing it, you'll see that those notches line up, and that will allow us to make sure that everything matches perfectly when we sew. If you find something like a triple notch, the triple notch usually indicates the center back, and we encounter that on the hood of our pattern. Other things like a double notch, you will see that on side seams or possibly other areas that are meant to match. The third thing that we want to cover besides notches and grain is the little dots that are on our pattern. And you're going to run into small dots and large dots. And you'll see on our pattern here that there are different dots indicating different sizes, from extra small to small and medium. You might have a large or an extra large or some other size of pattern based on which pattern you're using. But what's really important is you do want to use your marking pencil or chalk and make sure when you're cutting your pattern pieces out that you mark those notches or things that look like triangles. And we do encounter some of those when we are stitching our hood onto our hoodie pattern. Make sure you mark everything really well. It's going to give you the best results and success when you're putting your garment together. Okay, well, we're gonna go ahead and put some pins on here. And for those of you that are new sewers, I just wanna point out that people pin differently. Some people use a lot of pins, some people use minimal pins. Do what's comfortable for you. Some people will pin parallel or perpendicular to the pattern. I typically like to go parallel to the edge of the pattern, and some people will pin toward the outside of the pattern. So whatever works for you, just make sure that when you're cutting your pattern out that you aren't cutting the pins with your scissors. All right, well, we're gonna add some more pins and we're gonna cut this out. The main takeaway on this particular pattern is the front pattern piece has a marking for the opening which we will be putting our zipper on. So look at your pattern piece and find whatever size you're making, small, medium, large, extra large. And what you're going to want to make sure is that you're very accurate when you mark this on the front of your pattern piece. And you'll notice that there is a broken stitching line. I highly recommend that you actually mark that out on your pattern. So if we look here, and it doesn't have to be really, really dark. And this is actual fabric. So again, don't worry about it being real dark, but the key is that you have these precise points on the pattern. If it helps, you can take a ruler and you can mark across the bottom. And your fabric might wiggle just a little bit. And you can also take a ruler and mark vertically up your fabric. Your pattern guide does not tell you to do this. This is kind of a joy tip or trick because it's going to help us to have a very precision opening for inserting our zipper. And everyone knows how challenging that can be, but with a few care and attention and details taken in how we mark our pattern, that is what's going to give us the successful results when we're actually inserting the zipper. We are ready to sew at the sewing machine. We just want to pay attention to a few settings. We have a stretch or a knit needle on our sewing machine because we are working with a stretchy fabric. And typically what most sewers will use is a universal, like a polyester universal thread. But there are always new technologies coming out in our industry. And a very new one that I want to share is this Sarah Flex thread. And of course it's a thread, so it's a little difficult to see on camera, but you'll see as I'm pulling this that there's a lot of give with that. And the great thing about that is it allows the seam flexibility. And if you've ever sewn a knit garment on a home sewing machine, you just don't get those results that you see when you use a serger. Now, if you have a serger, you can absolutely utilize that in this project, and I'll try to share with you some times when you can use that. But we are also using a regular sewing machine with a regular straight stitch for a good majority of the assembly on this project. Therefore, a thread that has some give to it, and this very, very high quality thread, is going to allow our seams to move and stretch as we wear the garment, if we put it on over our body, and just basically have that flexibility. So keep that in mind when you're using stretch fabrics, and if you need a very functional and flexible seam, then you want to make sure you're using a high quality thread with stretch and that you are using your knit needle. Okay, well, our machine is set up and ready to go. We are going to be stitching with a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, and that's a standard in-home sewing patterns. We'll do a little run through here on the sewing machine, and what we're doing is there are markings on the plate of our machine. If you're a seasoned sewer, you know exactly what this is, but some of you that are new are not going to have any idea what that means. So 5/8 of an inch is the distance from the edge of the fabric to where the needle is putting a stitch through your seam basically to create the garment. So find that 5/8 of an inch mark on your machine, put your needle and your foot down, and then you're going to be able to sew forward and backwards. Now I am sewing a knit fabric with a regular sewing machine, and this is just a scrap sample piece of fabric. We have a 101 Nancy's Notions Wardrobe Builder video on knit fabrics and sewing knit fabrics. You'll want to reference that for a lot more information. But you'll notice that I was able to do a flexible seam with that thread. See how that moves? And it's a beautiful seam. And we can take this over, we can iron that out, relax the stitches, but it's balanced on the front and the back. So it is possible to get very professional results with your sewing machine. Sometimes it's just a matter of the right settings. So make sure you do a test sample before you get started on your actual garment. Okay, the first step in creating this three-dimensional garment is our pocket, and I am going to lay my pocket piece right here. If we put our markings on our pocket, and we talked about how important those markings are for the success in our project, you'll see this as we go along. We have 2 dots, and they're not real dark, but those are dots that are telling me where to start and stop my sewing. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to fold the edge of the pocket piece over, and we are going to be following almost step by step the pattern instructions from our pattern. There are a few deviations that I tell you about, so you can certainly reference your instruction sheet to get the written and the technical layout of what we're doing here. But the idea here is that we are going to make a finished edge on the pocket, and we are going to put this under the machine. And because I have this edge folded under, you certainly could run a serging stitch across this, but it's going to be on the inside, so it's not a necessary step in the process. All right, we're gonna run and I'm gonna move my pin. And the idea here is that we do wanna go right up to the edge. See how the needle got right to the edge of the fabric? And I'm gonna go backwards and then forwards. And that is important because when we turn this edge to the inside, let's flip that around, you'll be able to have a nice point. Now, because this is a knit, I try not to start right on the edge of the fabric. I like to go up to the edge. That way, when you get to the end, you just don't have your fabric being sucked right into the machine. And I am going to do a reverse stitch there, 3 or 4 forward and back, which is going to tie that off. And I'm going to now flip this to the inside. One little trick that you can do is you can certainly take some scissors that have a nice point or a point turner. There are lots of little gadgets and things. You can kind of poke that point out, and then you're going to repeat that on the other side. The next optional technique that you can do is you can certainly top stitch across here or run that through with a serger or a cover stitch. Now I have a sample that is already done. And here, what we've done is we've done a cover stitch right across that edge. That's the edge where the hand goes into the pocket. And then I went all the way around the edges and folded them under and pressed them with the iron. So this is ready now to attach to the front of our hoodie pattern, which I'm going to snag this piece right here. So this is actually the front of my hoodie. The pocket's going to be going down here. We'll slide this back. But while we're at the sewing machine, I want to point out that your pattern instructions tell you to reinforce the zipper opening. And this is not a step that you want to skip. You'll thank me later, but easily we can go to our machine and just stitch right around that opening. I don't feel the need to put a smaller stitch on there, or to put a larger one, I should say, because the small stitches are going to help reinforce. Now, an important takeaway is that when we are stitching around, we want to be very precise, and so that's why marking your pattern is key. So my needle is in here, I lifted the presser foot, and that allowed me to rotate the fabric. We're going to put the presser foot down, and I'm going to stitch across the bottom of the zipper opening. All right, and I want to make sure that I stop in that precise spot, lift the needle and rotate the fabric. I'm not making anything here. I'm just basically putting a stabilizing stitch in that opening. And I don't really need to back stitch there. All right. So we're ready now to attach our pocket and then continue on with creating our hoodie. We are ready to attach the front pocket to the front of the hoodie. This is a great example of that component sewing that I talked about in our introduction. Now what that means is we're going to do a step to this pattern piece before we create a three-dimensional garment. And it just reduces bulk and it makes sewing much easier. Anything you can do flat on a garment, you want to do that before you make it a three-dimensional garment. In our case here, we have the pocket. We've already stitched the edges down. So this edge right here, and along with this one, is going to be where the hands go into the pocket. The other edges are folded. I do have a few pins on here which are holding that folded edge down. I'm going to share a couple tips and tricks that I use when I'm applying some sort of pocket or technique where I need to attach two things together and the fabrics might shift a little. Now this is a great stable fabric, but it is a knit, and so it does have some give to it, and there's nothing like simply just pinning a piece on and going to your machine and expecting it to stay in place. Now your pattern instructions are not going to tell you anything other than place the pocket on here, pin it, and sew around it. But that's easier said than done at times. So there is a little tool, and this is exactly what it looks like. It is a glue stick, but it's a fabric glue stick. And this is a great one that you literally can run the glue stick just along that folded edge. There's some, glue on there, and then you can just press that down, and it helps to anchor. These are not as heavy duty. If you have a heavier fabric or you find that it's just not enough, then the next thing you want to try is something called a fabric spray adhesive. Now this is not art adhesive, so you want to make sure that you are using a temporary spray adhesive and that says it can be used on fabrics. All right, so what we're gonna do, I have the pocket placed on here. It's all lined up, and I just simply used a ruler and drew my lines on there. I marked the center front, so I have that cross section, so everything is lined up as it needs to be lined up. We're gonna squirt just a little. You'll kind of see what that looks like on there. You do not need to saturate the whole thing, so just a little bit of spray adhesive in the area where you're working because it is sticky, and then you can press that down and it really is gonna stay nicely. If there's a little runoff, you can remove that with a wet cloth, and this does eventually dissolve, so it's not gonna hurt your fabric. Of course, if you have a silk or something very specialty, I maybe would probably omit using that. But for a project like this, that is a fantastic tool so that we can line this up. It's going to hold all those edges. We're ready now to stitch across the top, down the sides, and across the bottom. Make sure you leave that hand opening free, and we'll stitch this on the machine and be ready for our next step. We are going to start making this a three-dimensional garment. Our pocket's on there. What we're gonna do next is we're gonna lay the back of the garment on top of the front. We're gonna lay them right sides together. That means the pretty side of the garment that you're gonna see on the outside of the wearer is the right side. And so we wanna make sure when we put those together, those right sides are touching. We're gonna line up the shoulder, and we're gonna line up down the side seam areas to create the shoulder and the side seams. Before we do that, I just want to point out we have our stabilized neckline / zipper edge right here, and then we also have our little triangular markings marked. That's going to line up when we attach the hood. All right, one thing I want to point out is that when we lay the back on top of the front, it's very common to anticipate and expect that it to lay perfectly flat, but on many garments that is not the case. It's very common for the front or back or whatever piece you're working with that one of them will be a different width or a different size than the other. So if you're pinning something together and you're trying to have everything lay really flat, but you're wondering why there's extra space over here, it's because it's not meant to lay perfectly flat. Remember, this is a three-dimensional garment. So as you're pinning, and I turn this around here, right now I'm gonna pin the shoulder seam. I've got the seams right sides together. They're lined up beautifully, so I am not worried about any other part of the garment at this point. Because sometimes what I might need to do is yank this over and then lay the other corresponding part on the back of the pattern. So this will give us a couple pins to anchor the shoulder seams. And this one is a pretty even pattern, but you'll even notice as I line up the side seams here, see how there's just a little extra because there's a slightly longer length in the back of the pattern. And so naturally, we're gonna have some extra right here because that is gonna compensate for over the roll of the shoulder. But we know that once we fill this up with our body, that it's gonna lay nice and beautifully. So we are going to take this to the sewing machine, and we're going to use that 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, and I'm going to stitch down the sides, across the shoulders. I'm also going to go ahead and go to my serger. If you have a serger and you want to put that edge finish on there, now's a great time to do that. If you don't have a serger, you can certainly experiment with zigzag stitches or stretch stitches that you have on your regular sewing machine. So try that out. Let's get that together, and then we are ready to jump into the hood of the pattern, which is the star of the show. The hood is actually very easy to assemble. What we are going to do is we're going to sew around that center back edge of the hood. If we remember, we have the triple notch, which is going to help us line those pieces together. So we're going to go ahead and stitch this. And I'm using the 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Okay, now we have an option. We can certainly go to our serger and edge finish off the hood, but we do know that our hood has a lining, and that is not going to be an exposed seam. And sometimes eliminating bulk in a seam is a great idea. So I'm going to omit putting any sort of additional edge finish because it's not necessary. Now you can trim some of the bulk of the seam down if you choose to do so, but I don't think that's going to affect anything on this project. So we're going to flip our hood open. We might want to go and press that seam just so it's not really ripply, but it doesn't have a real nice crease in it. So you'll want to take that to your ironing board and put a nice press on that. Okay, we're going to join the hood to the neckline edge of our garment. And this is actually pretty easy because remember, we've focused on notches and we have chalk markings on the inside. There's a triangle, which that is going to line up with our shoulder seam and the center back, which is always where I start. I'm going to attach this hood right sides together to the neckline of the garment. I'm going to match the shoulder seam, the notch, and the front, and it'll make it a nice, easy shot from one end to the other, and the hood will then be attached. If it helps, you can put a pin at the center back because we don't actually have a seam going down the back of our garment. And I think at this point, I am also going to cut down the center to but not through. So I'm going to hold that nice and flat. To but not through. And what this does is this is going to be the opening for our zipper. And by cutting that now, it just gives me a little more space to work when I attach the hood. I do want to angle my scissors and refer to your pattern instruction sheet. There's a great little illustration for clipping to but not through the corners of our stay stitched zipper neckline. All right. Right sides together. I'm matching the center back of the hood to the center back of the neckline, okay? And I'm at the shoulder seam here. This again is a really great wardrobe builder knit. It comes in over 13 colors, which gives you a ton of options for matching whatever wardrobe or sports team, or if you're going to make something for career wear or cruise wear. There's just a lot of options there. But the nice thing is that this is a stable knit, so it's really very user-friendly. And for those that are learning to sew, or even if you're a confident sewer, but you need just a little more experience, especially with necklines and collars and zippers, there's just a little give. I'm gonna kind of put a little stretch there. And if you have one, which you will do what's called easing. And what that means is you have one pattern piece that's just slightly longer than the other, and you have to ease it in. And so you've got a little give, you can just kind of give a little tension, and that piece is gonna fit beautifully into the seam. And of course, we're matching our notches. Let's pin the other side, and then we are ready to stitch around this using the 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Now, while I'm pinning this, I want to point out that the process will be the same for attaching the center back seam of our hood lining or facing. I believe our pattern calls it a facing, but it's quite much like a lining. Anyways, we are going to go ahead and sew the center back seam of the lining as well, so that that is ready to go when we are ready to attach it to the front of the hoodie. This is all pinned. We're going to run this circular shape through the machine. Now you'll notice in a couple spots I did sew over a pin. That's not normally recommended, but I do it quite often. It's important to make sure that your pin is going vertically, but once in a while it is possible that your needle will land on the pin, and if that's the case, then you'll have to replace your needle. Okay, so I am going to run to my serger and do a serger stitch around this neckline opening, but that will be covered with our facing, so that's not an option, or that's an optional finish. Well, let's take a look here. You'll see that our hood is attached to the neckline, and we're going to move on to our next step. We are ready to tackle inserting a zipper into the 3/4 opening on the front of our hoodie. Now I want to do this in more detail, so jump on over to our wardrobe video 101 videos, and you're going to see every step on how to do that. Hopefully, and I am pretty confident that it's going to be very easy for you to achieve. Now, once your zipper is inserted, and I want to let you know that there are many zippers out there. This is just a sampling of zippers. You can do color blocking where you have a contrasting zipper. You can select a coordinating zipper, a rhinestone zipper, whatever your choice is, and even a contrasting thread. So have a little fun when you're doing that aspect of your project. It just personalizes it that much more. Now, once your zipper is inserted, we are ready to finish off the opening of our hood, and then we're just going to add some sleeves, add a hem, and you'll be all done. So let's jump over to the sewing machine and see what it looks like on how we are going to add the facing to the front of our hood and get that finished up. We've already stitched the center back seam around the hood facing. We're now going to join the hood facing to the fashion, or the correct right side of the fashion hood. And it's very, very easy. Remember those right sides together. We are going to line up the center back seam, put a pin in there, and basically wrap the facing, or the lining around the hood. And this is the opening that your face will go through. And so by joining that front edge, you'll put a couple pins in there to make sure everything lines up. And this really is an easy technique. I'm going to unzip a little bit of the zipper there. It's just going to give us a little more wiggle room for being able to maneuver around our sewing machine. Now, what you're going to find is that, let's lay this out here. This edge is going to have a piece of fabric that extends a little bit beyond the zipper opening, and that's supposed to be there. We can fold that under, and there are a couple, I modified the pattern a little bit. There are a couple ways that we can stitch that down, but I actually like to just fold that back, and then when we turn this to the inside, it gives it a nice finished edge, and we can tack that in place. So let me pin that. I'll hold that there so you can see that. All right, now we are ready to sew all the way around . All right, now I am coming upon that center back seam, so I just slowed down a little bit to make sure that those seams went through the sewing machine nice and even, and so that they didn't shift. Great. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to flip the facing to the inside of the hood. Now I haven't pressed this yet, but I want you to get an idea of where we're going with this. You can zip that up. And that is going to create the hood of our garment with a nice finish edge. But we do want to address this this finished edge just a little so that it's a little more polished. Now, I definitely, at minimum, want to go to my iron and put a nice press around that. But what's a better technique is to do what is called understitching. And what that is we want to pull this open and we want to actually stitch the seam allowance that is underneath the seam toward the lining. And we're going to place this underneath our sewing machine and we're going to stitch as close as we can to the seam with the seam allowance going this direction. And what that does is it allows that to lay nice and flat, so when we turn this inside, that those edges turn really, really evenly and you're not losing any sort of space in the garment that's accidentally tucked into the seam line. The other thing that we want to mention is that depending on the fabric you're using, if you're using like a faux fur or some type of fabric that you might be hand stitching, you can certainly go in and catch the seam allowance by hand, or you can top stitch around, like if you were doing denim or a lighter weight cotton fabric, you could certainly top stitch. And in that case, you can omit the understitching as long as you press everything before you begin. Well, I am going to go ahead and understitch on my garment, and then I'm going to turn that and press. And the final step for this hood is that we are going to turn under the facing edge and we are going to stitch that down to the seam allowance where the hood is attached to the neckline. And it provides a nice clean finish. All of that unfinished edges of the seams in the hood and the neckline are completely encased in the facing or the lining, and just makes for a nice finish. Once your facing is tacked down, the next step is to attach our sleeves. We are ready to attach the sleeve to our hoodie. Now I want to share just a few tips or techniques that are going to help ensure that you have successful results. First of all, we are working with a stretch fabric, so there's a little bit of give in how the pattern joins to the overall body of the garment. So that, number one, is going to help anyone that's a new sewer. If you're a confident sewer, it's a great opportunity just to hone some of your skills, and particularly how you mark your pattern. Now, I emphasized at the beginning of this lesson how important it is to make sure you mark things like dots, notches, or those little triangles that are notated on our paper pattern. And why that's important is that that is going to ensure that those areas of the pattern mark or match or correspond to another part of the pattern. Now, this sleeve actually is a really easy one to do, so I have the utmost confidence you guys are gonna have great results. But let's take a look. We remember that we have a large notch at the top of our sleeve, and then there are two small dots as well. Those are gonna help to line up the front of the sleeve to the front of the armscye, as well as the back of the sleeve to the back of the armscye. Now, also, there are things like notches. When we fold our sleeve in half, like we have here, the notch, the single notch that's down the side seam is going to match. And that's important because you don't want your side seams to shift. They really should match exactly, and then that's going to allow for your sleeve to hang straight on the body. We're going to fold our sleeve in half and then take this to the sewing machine, run a basic straight stitch down the side seam. You can certainly serge that if you need to, and then we're going to be ready to insert this into the body of the garment. We've sewn the side seam down our sleeve. We're now ready to attach the sleeve to the body of our hoodie. Now, you'll remember that I talked about these notches and marking your pattern and how important that is. So the double notches are going to indicate that that part of the sleeve is on the back of the garment. The single notch is going to indicate that that part of the sleeve is on the front of the garment. Now, this area right here, the arm opening, is usually called the armscye or the armscye, depending on how you like to pronounce it, but it doesn't really matter. What you just need to recognize is that when you're holding the garment open, you have a shoulder seam, and the front of the garment is going to be the side that is toward the zipper, and then the back obviously is the opposite. So when you line up your sleeve, how we want to do that, or how I like to do it, there are a couple different ways. Some people will turn their garment inside out. I like to start with my garment right side out. And what I like to do is take my sleeve and hold it up so that I can definitely make sure that the front notch matches and the back notch matches. Now, on the underside of my sleeve are those little dots, and you won't be able to see it here, but there is a large dot that indicates that's the center point of the top of the sleeve. And if I just kind of hold this right here, you'll see that it's the cap of the sleeve is what that is, and that's that top point that is going to match the shoulder seam. So again, what I like to do is hold these together, and then that way there's no accidentally sewing the sleeve to the wrong side. Now, this is a forgiving pattern, so if you did that, it probably isn't going to ruin the project and you may never notice. But once you get into tailored garments or things like a jacket or woven patterns, the sleeve shape changes slightly based on how the pattern is made. And when that happens, it's really important that you get the right sleeve on the right side. So now is a really great time to practice that skill for future use, even if it's simple. All right, so what we're gonna do is, like I mentioned, line these up, and what I like to do is just kind of pinch that. We're gonna do right sides together. So as I put those on there, and I'm just kind of walking through this, we'll take a look at it a little closer at the sewing machine, but I just want you to see kind of my process for doing that. And it's a lot of people do this. But again, we're gonna hold those together. My hand is on the underside of the sleeve, and I'm just kind of pinching these together so that I know that it's kind of started in the right place. So we're gonna flip this to the inside, and I'm gonna match up that large dot with that shoulder seam. So now I'm on the inside of the garment. I'm going to put a pin there, and then what I'm going to do is match up those small dots, and then I'm going to match that underarm seam to the underarm seam of the body of the jacket, ease that in, and then we'll be able to take that to the sewing machine. We're ready to sew around that arm opening. You'll notice that I have the pins here holding the sleeve into the arm's eye, or that arm opening. It's not uncommon for the sleeve to be slightly longer than that overall opening. And we did what was called easing, and you'll notice here that there's just a little bit of ripple in the sleeve. And what happens is that as we put a little bit of tension on that, you'll see that that line that's a little bit longer relaxes and it fits into that area, and that's called easing. And you do want a little bit of easing of the sleeve into the arm's eye, because that's going to help create that three-dimensional shape. So keep that in mind. As we're doing the sleeve, I like to start at the underarm seam, and that allows me to start on a part that matches pretty literally. And so then when I get up here, I've already got the lower part of the sleeve, it's kind of a U shape, that's already situated, and then I can focus on approaching each one of these pins, easing and removing the pin, and then when I come around on the other side of it, it's a nice kind of transition into the other side of the underarm, and you have a beautiful sleeve placement. We're going to be using that 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, so let's place that under the machine. And this is just an area that it's not about sewing really quickly. It's a circle, so we don't have to worry about sewing fast. We want to do it accurately. So, and because it's a circle, we need to do a little bit of rotation as we sew. All right, so I'm going to start at the underarm, as I mentioned, forward and back stitch. I'm going to remove that underarm pin. You'll see that I'm able to stitch right up to the first pin and remove that. And I'm just going to shift my sleeve. So what I want is the next part that I'm going to sew to be in the front area of the machine. The rest of the garment can kind of rest toward the back, or whatever is comfortable for you. But I'm really only worried about a small portion fitting in this area of the machine, and then once I get to the next pin, I can rotate. That'll be really, really important as you get into other types of garments, especially those that don't stretch. All right, make sure that there's nothing underneath there. We're gonna stitch. All right, we're gonna continue. I'm just rotating a little bit with my hand there. All right, now we're approaching that cap of the sleeve, and there's just a little bit of easing. And you never want to pull your fabric, but what you can do is provide a little tension. And you'll see there, as I'm providing some tension, that this upper part starts to relax. And so that's going to allow that sleeve, as I mentioned, to fit nicely right into the arm's eye. Now you will notice that I am actually stitching over top of the pins. That's probably a taboo thing to do. So what you'll also notice that I didn't go over them very quickly. So if you feel like you need to leave the pin, if you're a new sewer, what I would recommend is stop and then take your hand over to the hand wheel and turn the wheel towards you. That'll allow you to go over the pin and then remove that. Sometimes we develop bad habits, which is probably what I'm doing there by stitching over top of it. As a confident sewer, that's a common trait for me in my own personal sewing, but it really is not recommended. You don't want to certainly throw off the mechanism on your machine. So if your machine doesn't handle that very well, just keep that in mind. But I'm just kind of being real here. That's a mannerism that I have. Ideally, as you come closer, you'll remove the pin. Stop, and you'll notice that I'm kind of toward the back of the machine, so I'm going to shift the fabric around. You'll see over here we're a little over halfway through that circle. Remove the pin and try to remove it just right as the needle's coming up upon that. All right, we're almost to the other side. You'll notice that I have less easing to do, that we're pretty much on the home stretch. And I'm at the underarm now. I'm going to reverse, cut my thread. Now, if there are any pins left here, that's probably because I sewed over them. All right, it's kind of one of those don't do as I do moments, but our sleeve is now, let's flip that around. Our sleeve is now attached into the armscye, and here you'll notice that slight ripple, and that is a really good example of what that easing looks like. And I've mentioned a couple times already, but when you get into things like wool fabrics or other non-stretch fabrics, that easing is really important because that allows that roll that happens over the shoulder. If your sleeve pattern is too short, then you have a very flat sleeve and it doesn't comfortably fit over the roundedness of your shoulder. So just keep that in mind. If you have a pattern that has inches of excess fabric, so you line up the dots in the shoulder and there's just so much fabric in there, there's a good chance that either your pattern wasn't graded very well and so that it's a lesser quality pattern. So pay attention to that. You might need to do a pre-fit or a practice sleeve just to kind of check that out and see what's going on and reference your pattern in that regard. So that's just a little professional tip to keep in the back of your mind when you're approaching other patterns. Okay, what you can do now is if you want to serge around that, if you have a serger, that's a great area to apply an edge finish. I do want to point out that I use just a straight stitch on this armscye, and it's an area that has bias or stretch anyways. There's a lot of give there, and so it's not necessary to do a zigzag stitch or anything like that. You'll see that as I kind of tug on here, and I have that beautiful Ceraflex stretch thread in there, which is really wonderful. I can tug on this really, really tight, and those stitches are not going to pop out of there. So you don't need to do anything unique or special to that armscye seam. Just make sure that you, again, focus on lining everything up and you use a normal size stitch that your machine recommends, and you'll have great success. The finishing touch to any garment is a polished hem, and how you create that hem is going to determine whether you have professional results or that home sewing look, which we all want to avoid. Now, I'm going to share with you a few techniques on some different things that you can do to ensure that you have amazing results. Our pattern provides us a few suggestions, such as a rolled hem, applying a casing, or in this example here, adding some sort of binding to the bottom of your hem. The choice is yours. Be creative and really make it your own. So I'm going to start with the edge of the sleeve, and the three parts of this pattern that need an edge finish are the two sleeve edges and then the overall bottom edge of the hem of the garment, and we're going to treat them the same. Now on this particular sleeve, I have a serged edge on the bottom here. So those of you that have a serger, feel free to utilize that. It just puts a nice finish on the bottom of that. You may not have a serger and you might simply have just a raw edge to the bottom of your garment, and that's completely fine. We will utilize what you have and give you some tips for making that look just as good as the other. Now, there are stitches on your machine, or many machines will have things like a zigzag stitch, and some newer machines will have a mock serger stitch, which will put kind of a zigzag with that double row of stitching on there. So just, experiment on a sample piece of fabric, and if you like the idea of having a finish on there, that's something that you can utilize. So when you have an edge finish, that will allow you to take the edge of your garment and simply turn it under once, and then you can stitch it from the outside, and if you were to flip that over on the inside, it would look something like this. So again, you just have a little bit of a polished edge right there. Now, back to those of you that do not have a serger, an option would be to turn under the raw edge. And actually, let's grab the one that doesn't have anything. So if you were to turn that under once and then turn it under again, and you can make that however wide you want, and then if you were to stitch around that, this is what it would look like on the inside. And that actually is a true double fold rolled hem. And it's finished off because there's a roll allowing the seam edge to be encased on the inside. Those of you that are doing some sort of casing, and what a casing is it's a tunnel. So you would take something like this and you're going to stitch really close to that folded edge, and then you're going to leave a little opening, usually where the intersection of that the side seam is, and then using like a safety pin, you're going to run like a a toggle through there, some elastic, whatever you want. And the whole idea of the casing is that it encases some sort of, again, elastic or binding that you can then stretch in order to cinch that in. So there's lots of options. We're gonna go over here to our serged edge, and I wanna talk about how we're gonna mark this hem. There's a little tool called a hem gauge, which is really great. Your pattern will usually tell you how much fabric or space is left at the bottom edge of the sleeve for hemming your garment. You might want to try yours on. Maybe there's a little extra length in the sleeve, or maybe you intentionally cut your sleeve longer because you have longer arms like I do. But whatever is in your pattern, you can use a tool like this where you will line up the edge of the ruler, and you'll notice that there's a nice flat edge here where you can run a chalk mark. So I'm just going to put, and this is just giving me about a 1-inch hem allowance. And I'm not going to make this really, really dark, although this chalk will certainly evaporate when I iron it. But you will see, let's connect the dots there and grab our little glue stick there. But the idea is that you are putting a reference mark on your garment so that in turn you can fold on that mark or slightly beyond the mark. And why I say that is there are some marking pencils that don't erase quite as easy as others. And so my tip is to have your chalk mark just to the inside of the hem allowance instead of right on the edge. If it's right on the edge, and I know this is kind of faint, so it's not going to be real dark for you to see, but if it's right on the edge and it happens to not wash away right away, then you're going to see that line. So take that into consideration when you're marking your hem, where you put that mark. So maybe it's 1/4 of an inch in or 1/8 of an inch, so then you have a nice finished raw edge and you don't see any sort of detail on there. Okay, so I want to throw out a tip that I shared early on when we attach the pocket. New sewers need any sort of tip they can get for great results. So using a fabric glue stick is a great tool. And you can put and you don't need a lot. It's really just to kind of anchor. So you can put just a scant amount of fabric glue stick on your hem and turn that under and kind of pinch it together. And again, it's not going to anchor it real tightly. It's just a little bit of a tool to kind of help hold that. And that's again going to help so that the fabric doesn't shift. So now I can go and put a pin in there, and I'm going to do that all the way around the sleeve and use the glue stick if you like that idea. We're going to pin that in place, and then that will allow me to run that through the sewing machine. So let me pin that. And I have a ruler here. I think I will show you one other little trick. And there are many. So if you don't have a hem gauge, another thing you can do is, let's say for example, there is exactly 1 inch, or maybe there's more. So you figure out where the finished edge or the finished roll of your fabric is going to be. So wherever that's going to be, and you need a ruler or a nice straight edge, and make sure your sleeve is flat and that it's laying even, and you can actually use the edge of the ruler. And I'm going to share a fun little tip. So you'll see that that gave me a nice straight line. Well, if I put the ruler on this side, and look what I'm doing here, I'm going to roll this up and hold it, and then I'm going to run this chalk right along the edge. All right, so then when I remove that, you'll see that I have a marking on the corresponding side. And the cool thing about that is, and determine whatever width of the hem allowance you want. So this is a 1 inch ruler. If I wanted a 1/2 of an inch, I actually have a 1/2 of an inch ruler. So we're gonna go ahead and mark that on this side. And again, you can leave your ruler, make sure you're holding it nice and snug. And then what I'm doing on the underside is I'm running the chalk along the edge of the ruler. So when I do that, it allows me to basically lay it on the table and basically swipe that and do another swipey there. And you'll see that there is an additional line on the back. So I can go in and remove that and know that I have a nice consistent edge. Where I learned to do that was way back when I was about 15, maybe 16 years old in high school. I worked for a tailor shop and we hemmed a lot of men's suit pants. And so one of my tasks would be to sit at the table and take a ruler and literally just mark, 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 and grab another pair and mark it. And so you get, little tricks like that become really efficient in your sewing. So I just shared a few options for you. Try them all. It's a great basic skill to practice. You'll use this exact same technique for hemming things like khaki or chino pants. If you're doing shorts, maybe in a future wardrobe video, maybe I'll share with you how to do a cuff on a pair of pants. So we'll learn more and apply that. All right, well, let's go back to this guy right here. I am going to put a few pins in there to hold this in place. Use that glue stick if you like. If you are going to be using the glue stick, it is important that you wipe down your needle every once in a while. Even if you're not using a lot, some of that glue or that sticky stuff will adhere to your needle. And so you can take some rubbing alcohol or sometimes just a wet washcloth and wipe it off as well. All right, so very similar to that arm's eye, we have a circular area here. Now, some people use what's called the arm of the machine. And so I have a flat table here. You can see that. It's really pretty and shiny. So if I were to remove that, if this were my machine, I could lay the sleeve, because it's a smaller area, on the machine like this and stitch around, allowing that to rotate. Now, some of you, and the technically correct way to sew is that you have a large flat surface. You may or may not have that, but if you're not able, or your opening is too small that you can't get that on the arm of the machine, then what you need to do is put your hem under the presser foot like that arm's eye, and you're going to do the hem from the inside of the garment. Or if you flip it inside out, then you're basically going to be sewing from the right side, if that makes sense. So experiment with that. But what I'm going to do here is, this is my personal preference, I love sewing it in this way because I can utilize that folded edge of the hem and I can line that up with any of the markings on my machine. And there you can take tape, you can tape that out. There are some adhesive rulers that you can use. So lots of tools. And whoops, I'm going to rotate this around. I like to start at that intersection where that seam allowance, let's pull that back out. So there's the turn under edge of the side seam that runs vertically down the sleeve. And I like to start there. It gives me an opportunity to start and stop at an intersection. There's also some tricks with that if you're hemming pants and other tailored garments. Again, I can't share everything here, but I'm just going to tell you that sometimes there's intentional reasons to do that show up on other types of sewing. Okay, so I'm going to line up the folded edge with the marking on my machine. And this is a circular area, but it has quite a lot of give. I don't need to stretch this fabric as I'm sewing it. We're going to use that stretch thread, so that gives me some give when I'm putting my arm in and out of the sleeve. And there's just enough ease that it's not hugging my wrist really snug. So I'm not worried about popping any stitches or anything. So a straight stitch works beautifully here. I'm going to use about a 3/4 of an inch hem allowance. Remove my pin as I get to it. There are other finishes that you can put on here as well. Roll that around. Now this rolled edge that I'm doing also will double as a casing, so reference your pattern instruction for an illustration of what we're doing here. If I indeed want to insert some sort of elastic, and here, let's just take a look here. You'll see that that is the turned edge, and I'll take it to my iron and iron that. But I haven't quite gotten to where I started, so I've got about a 1-inch gap in here. If I want to insert some sort of elastic, now's the time to do it. So I would take this out of my machine and put a safety pin on either side of a piece of elastic, however snug I want to go around my wrist, and I'm going to insert that through here and either tie off the elastic or overlap and stitch the ends together, and then I'll come back to the machine and then I'm going to sew shut that little opening. So the same process applies either for just a single roll rolled hem, and let's get some of our little threads off of there. So otherwise, if you don't like the idea of a casing, you have a beautiful even hem because we've lined that up, we've marked it beautifully, we've sewn that with a beautiful thread. You'll see if I pull it that really taut, it's flexible, it's gonna take the tension, and you've got a great hem. So we'll turn around, we'll apply that to the hem of our garment, and you will have completed sewing your own fashion hoodie. Thanks for joining us in this Nancy's Notions wardrobe builder video. I hope you enjoyed making your own fashion hoodie. If you have any questions, feel free to ask those here. We'll answer them and even post additional videos if necessary. Don't forget to like and subscribe and share your successes. We'll see you next time in Nancy's Notions wardrobe builder.